They built monuments that still stand. They engineered water systems that modern cities couldn't replicate for another 1,000 years. And every single morning, in the most intimate moment of their day, every person in Pompeii reached for the same wet sponge. The same one their neighbor just used, and the one before that. What you're looking at isn't a curiosity, it's a biological crime scene. Here's a number that should stop you cold. Archaeologists excavating Roman latrine sediment, actual fossilized waste from Pompeii and Herculaneum, found evidence of at least 4 distinct categories of intestinal parasites thriving simultaneously in the same population: whipworm, roundworm, entomoeba, and tapeworm. 4. In a civilization that had running water. That paradox is not an accident. It is the direct biological consequence of one object: the xylospongium. Picture it exactly as it sounds. A natural sea sponge, dense and porous, fixed to the end of a wooden stick roughly the length of your forearm. This was the Roman equivalent of toilet paper. And in Pompeii's public latrines, structures archaeologists have mapped extensively along the Via dell'Abbondanza and near the Forum. There was typically one per facility, not one per person. One per facility. It sat in a communal bucket of salt water or diluted vinegar between uses, which Romans genuinely believed was sufficient sanitation. It was not even close. The latrines themselves were, by any ancient standard, an engineering achievement. Pompeii's foracae, the formal term for public latrine facilities, were built over continuously flowing channels of water fed directly from the city's hydraulic network. The Aqua Augusta, one of the most sophisticated aqueduct systems ever constructed in the ancient world, moved water through lead and terracotta pipes at calculated hydraulic pressure gradients, flushing waste away from the seating area in a constant current. The seats themselves were carved from stone, positioned side by side with no partitions. Privacy was not a Roman cultural value in this context. Senators, slaves, merchants, and soldiers all sat shoulder to shoulder. Some archaeological sites suggest that these were actually social spaces where business was conducted, conversations were had, graffiti was carved into the walls mid-use. But here is where the forensic reality collides with the engineering marvel. The same hydraulic precision that moved waste out through the channels also created pathogen backflow. Researchers publishing in the journal Parasitology in 2016, analyzing coprolite samples and sediment from multiple Roman sites, concluded that the open channel system, combined with communal sponge use, created what they described as a closed-loop contamination cycle. Waste left the body, entered the channel, but aerosolized particles, contaminated water splashback, and direct sponge transmission ensured that pathogens were continuously reintroduced to the population using the same space. The vinegar bucket was not a solution. Acetic acid at that dilution cannot neutralize the eggs of Trichuris trichura, whipworm, which are notoriously resistant to environmental degradation. Those eggs survived. They transferred, they infected, over and over again, in a cycle that the Romans had no conceptual framework to understand, because germ theory was still 17 centuries away. What makes this forensically extraordinary is the gap between perception and biological reality. To a Roman citizen in 79 Anno Domini, the latrine was a sign of status and order, a city organized enough to manage waste collectively. The infrastructure was real. The intention was sanitary. The outcome, measured in parasitic load across the population, was a public health catastrophe hiding inside a marvel of civil engineering. And if you think the latrines were the only place where Roman biology was quietly unraveling behind a facade of sophistication, wait until you see what was happening on every street corner of the city, in broad daylight, with the full endorsement of the textile industry. Every morning in Pompeii, men stopped at ceramic pots placed deliberately at street corners and urinated into them. This was not vandalism, this was civic participation. The city's textile industry ran on it. The Phalanakae, Pompeii's commercial laundries, were among the most economically active businesses in the city. Archaeologists have identified at least 7 major Phalanaka operations within Pompeii's excavated area alone, the largest being the Phalanaka of Stephanus on the Via dell'Abbondanza. And the core chemical agent powering all of them was human urine, collected fresh from the street, fermented in large terracotta vats, and deployed specifically for its ammonia content. Ammonia bleaching is not a modern discovery. Romans arrived at it through pure empirical observation centuries before anyone understood the molecular mechanism behind it. The process was visceral. Slaves, and in larger operations, hired laborers, stood knee-deep in stone-treading basins filled with urine, wool, and water, working the fabric with their feet for hours. The ammonia broke down grease, lifted organic stains, and produced the blinding white that Roman togas demanded as a symbol of social standing. The word candidate, as in political candidate, derives directly from the Latin candidatus, meaning clothed in white. Political ambition, literally laundered in urine. The neighborhoods surrounding these facilities carried a chemical signature that no amount of open-air ventilation could fully disperse. The ammonia concentration in an active phylonica would have produced immediate mucous membrane irritation in anyone entering the space. Burning eyes, tightening in the chest, the kind of sensory assault that modern occupational health standards exist specifically to prevent. And yet the togas came out immaculate. That is the Roman paradox in its purest form. Profound filth engineered into the appearance of absolute purity. But if the laundries tell you what the Romans did with their waste products, the streets tell you something even more unsettling about what they walked through every single day. If you dropped a Roman citizen from 79 Anno Domini into a modern city and asked them what felt most alien, it would not be the electricity or the vehicles. It would be the silence of the streets. Because Pompeii's roads were not quiet infrastructure. They were active biological systems, and walking through them without the right knowledge could kill you slowly. The stepping stones you see in Pompeii's excavated streets are one of the most photographed features of the city. Tourists assume they were decorative or perhaps designed to help pedestrians cross during rain. Both assumptions are dangerously incomplete. Those stones existed because the streets of Pompeii were, in functional terms, open sewage channels. There was no dedicated underground waste pipe network for street-level runoff. Rainwater, animal waste from the constant movement of cattle, horses, and working animals, kitchen refuse thrown directly from doorways, and the overflow from latrines and fountains all converged in the street gutter and flowed downhill through the city's road grid. The stepping stones were precisely calibrated to the wheel ruts of Roman carts. Archaeologists have confirmed the standardized spacing matches the axle width of documented Roman vehicle types, allowing pedestrians to cross the flow without direct contact with the contaminated surface below. The pathogen loading on Pompeii's street-level soil would have been extraordinary by modern measurement standards. Fecal coliform bacteria, helminth eggs, animal-borne pathogens, all concentrated in the compacted earth between those wheel ruts. Roman sandals, by design, provided minimal barrier protection. Children played near these channels. Street food vendors operated directly alongside them. And speaking of food, because this is where the Roman relationship with biological reality becomes genuinely difficult to process. Nothing in Pompeii's daily diet illustrates the gap between ancient perception and modern microbiology, quite like the substance they poured on absolutely everything they ate. Archaeologists excavating Pompeii found something unexpected in the carbonized remains of the city's food storage areas. Perfectly preserved evidence of one of the most consumed condiments in the Roman world, garum. And once you understand what garum actually is at a biological level, the fact that Romans poured it on bread, mixed it into wine, and used it as a base for nearly every prepared dish becomes one of the most fascinating contradictions in culinary history. The production process was straightforward and deeply unsettling. Fish, typically anchovies, mackerel, or sardines, were packed whole into large clay vessels called dolia, layered with salt, and left exposed to direct Mediterranean sunlight for weeks. The internal enzymes of the fish, combined with halophilic bacteria thriving in the salt-heavy environment, broke down the flesh and organs through controlled autolysis and fermentation. The liquid that separated and was strained off the top of these vessels was garum. Technically, what Romans were consuming was the enzymatic byproduct of bacterial decomposition of fish viscera. Here is where the forensic picture becomes genuinely complex. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains from Pompeii and Herculaneum, published through studies conducted by the Herculaneum Conservation Project, shows that the Roman diet in this region was remarkably balanced. High in fish protein, complex carbohydrates, olive oil, and legumes, with minimal refined sugar. Dental analysis confirms exceptionally low rates of cavities compared to medieval European populations. These were not nutritionally deficient people, and yet their most prized condiment was, by any modern food safety classification, a product manufactured through the deliberate decomposition of raw fish in open-air conditions. The science, however, partially redeems them. High salinity fermentation environments inhibit the growth of genuinely dangerous pathogens like Clostridium botulinum. What garum's production process actually created was closer to a controlled fermentation, similar in principle to modern fish sauce used across Southeast Asia, rather than simple rot. The Romans did not know why it was relatively safe. They only knew that it tasted extraordinary and that civilized people used it on everything. But this is the defining characteristic of Pompeii that the vault exists to document. A civilization operating at the absolute frontier of what human intelligence could achieve without microscopy, without germ theory, without any of the invisible biological knowledge we now take for granted. Making decisions that were simultaneously brilliant and catastrophically blind. Here is the number that puts everything into perspective. When the Black Death swept through medieval Europe in the 14th century, roughly 1,300 years after Pompeii's daily life we have been examining, cities like London and Paris had no functioning sewer infrastructure, no public latrine systems, no aqueducts, and no organized waste removal. Waste was thrown directly from windows into streets that had none of Pompeii's stepping stones, none of its hydraulic channels, none of its engineered flow gradients. Europe regressed so far from Roman sanitary infrastructure that historians refer to it as one of the most catastrophic losses of civil engineering knowledge in human history. Pompeii, by comparison, was operating at a level of organized biological management that would not be matched in Western civilization for over a millennium. They understood hydraulic pressure well enough to deliver clean water to public fountains at calculated flow rates across an entire city grid. They understood that waste needed to move, away from living spaces, away from food preparation areas, away from water sources. They built systems to enforce that movement every single day. And simultaneously, they shared a sponge. That is not a contradiction. That is the precise definition of a civilization operating at the absolute boundary of its available knowledge. They solved every problem they could see. The ones that killed them slowly were the ones invisible to the naked eye. The parasitic eggs in the latrine channel, the pathogen transfer on a wet sponge, the bacterial load in a street-level puddle. Pompeii was not a city that failed. It was a city that succeeded at everything human intelligence could measure in 79 Anno Domini, and was quietly, systematically undermined by a microscopic world it had no tools to detect. If this investigation changed the way you think about what civilization actually means, not the marble, not the monuments, but the invisible biological reality underneath all of it, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to Vane's Historical Vault because every week we open a new file that history textbooks were never honest enough to include. Leave a comment below, telling me which part of Pompeii's daily life you found most disturbing. The sponge, the urine laundries, the streets, or the garum? Because that answer tells me exactly what to investigate next, and your comment directly shapes what goes into the vault.